All right. How is everybody? Awesome. I appreciate you all coming out, and I appreciate the museum for letting me come and talk. It's funny being a writer. People usually don't say, "Hey, you're a writer. Can you write us something?" They say, "Hey, you're a writer. Come and talk to us." It's like if you were a farmer and they said, "Hey, you grow great crops. Can you come and be our chef tonight?" It's not always the same skill. So some of this I'm reading, and hopefully the pictures are pretty enough that you can get past me reading some stuff here. But I definitely appreciate you all coming out. I want to talk to you about Texas Jack. This is Texas Jack Omohundro. A couple of different people use the name. He was the first and most important. Texas Jack Omohundro. And my book is Texas Jack, America's First Cowboy Star. We'll talk a little bit about what I mean when I say first cowboy star. But to talk about Texas Jack first, I want to talk a little bit about Mr. Will Rogers. Is that all right? All right. Will Rogers didn't leave home to become a showman or a star. He didn't leave home to become a star because he left home to be a cowboy. That was his plan. He didn't set out from his father's front door and head off to South Africa with dreams of bright lights and fame, because he didn't actually set out to try to go to South Africa at all. He had a plan in early 1902. Will and his friend Dick Paris decided they were going to try their luck as cowboys down in South America. So they came up with a plan, and they were going to head to Buenos Aires. And they thought the way to do this is that Will is going to sell his shares in the family cattle concern. He's going to divest himself of his interest in the family's business, and they're going to go first to Hot Springs, Arkansas. And from Hot Springs, Arkansas, they're going to head down to New Orleans. In New Orleans, they get on board a steamship, and they go back up to New York City. In New York City, they go to Southampton, England. Seems like an indirect route to me. From Southampton, England, they get on board a Royal Mail steamer that stops in the Cape Verde Islands, St. Vincent. It stops in Pernambuco and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and finally Montevideo, Uruguay, before it finally arrives in Buenos Aires 2.5 months after they left home. Dick Paris ends up leaving Argentina 19 days later. He did not cut it. But Will lasted a little bit longer. He made it to early August when he got on board a cargo ship that was packed with livestock bound for Durban, South Africa. In September, he wrote to his father from South Africa to let him know he was doing all right. He was working on a horse farm there. But by the end of November, he wrote again. And this time he said he was going to plan to drive some mules down to Ladysmith, South Africa. And when he got there, he was going to look for work. So on December 5th, Will Rogers walked onto the showgrounds of a Wild West show, wandering among the multicolored tents until he was finally directed by someone to the show's owner. The owner asked Will if he could do any bronco busting or any kind of rope tricks. And Will replied he thought he was a little bit better with the lasso than he was on the back of a horse. So the owner said, "Well, let's see what you can do." Will thought, "I'm going to start this simply." So he performed a trick called the crinoline. You all know what that is? That's where you take your lasso, you spin it over your head, and the loop gets wider and wider every time you twirl it. Well, before he could move on to the next trick, the owner of the show said, "You got a job." Will, of course, had seen these kind of tricks done before. He had gone up, actually was reminded of this by the great presentation we saw earlier, that Will had gone up to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1896 with his dad to sell some livestock. And while he was there, they stopped at Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was set up outside the Columbian Exposition grounds. And he saw a guy named Vicente Oropesa, who was at the time considered the greatest lasso artist who'd ever lived. So this really had impressed, I actually need to go one more. That is Vicente Oropesa right there. This really impressed Will. When he got back home, he set himself to working on these lasso tricks, which is why he could do this when he got to South Africa to impress the show's owner. Well, Will wrote a letter home to tell his family about the shrewd move the owner made that day. And this is what he said. He said, "I'm going to tell you how I missed out making $250. The owner does a trick with a rope, the big whirl where he lets out all his rope around him, and he's been offering 50 pounds, that is $250, for anyone that could do it, and he's been offering it for 5 years outside America. Well, I went down to the show one morning on getting into town, right there where it was, and I seen him in the tent, and I asked him for a job. He asked me if I could rope a bit. So he sent for his rope, and I got into the ring, and the first thing I'd done was this trick, which is common at home now. Well, I didn't know anything of this 50 pounds he was offering, so he gave me a job, and now he won't offer that. And as I belong to the show, I can't get it. So it was my misfortune that I did not hear of it and then go to the show some night when he offered it and step down and do it. Then I would have got the 250. Rogers concludes his letter home to his dad in this story by saying, "Oh, but I was mad." Mad as he was, Will decided to stick with the show. He'd set off from home to earn his living as a cowboy, but the months and the miles had changed what he wanted out of life. In another later home he wrote a little bit later, he told his family about what he hoped to gain from that Wild West show and from that owner. "I'm going to learn things while I'm with him that will enable me to make my living in the world without making it by day labor." He'd already decided that the life of the working man was not really what he was after. In later years, Roger credited the show owner with teaching him the ins and outs of show business, including how to work an audience, when to end an act, always leave him wanting more, and how to develop his skills with a lasso into a roping act that was fit for stage. That owner gave Will Rogers a new job and a new name: the Cherokee Kid. The career of one of America's most enduring and endearing entertainers was born. Now, if this was a comic book movie, that's your origin story. Now, while I was telling you all that, did any of you think, well, that's weird. Why was there a Wild West show in South Africa, of all places? What about the fact that, if I tell you that when Will left South Africa, he didn't come back to America to star in Wild West shows. He went to Australia next and did Wild West shows there. To understand kind of how the profession of the cowboy, which started with relatively humble beginnings of guiding bovines from point A to point B, became a viable entertainment career. So to think about that, we kind of have to start at the beginning. That's a Wild West show, as it was when Will set out to join one. So for much of American history, it was actually an insult to call a man a cowboy. During the American Revolution, cowboys were British loyalists who stole cattle and oxen from local farmers, and then they delivered them to hungry British troops. There was a man named Claudius Smith, who was known as the Cowboy of the Ramapos, who was actually hung for his crimes in New York in 1779 after the state's governor offered a $1,200 reward for his capture. The word cowboy remained decidedly unflattering well after Will Rogers' birth in 1879. In the early 1880s, the San Francisco Examiner said that, quote, "Cowboys are the most reckless class of outlaws in the wild country, infinitely worse than the ordinary robber." This was the era of the Cowboys of Cochise County, a particularly ruthless band of cattle rustlers and outlaws operating near Tombstone, Arizona, whose criminal activities were eventually curtailed by the shootout at, or kind of near, the OK Corral, and by the subsequent Earp Vendetta ride. Now, our modern view of the cowboy has been shaped by time and by several factors. The mid-1880s saw the expansion of the cattle industry from Texas and out across the entire West. American businessmen and rich investors from England, Ireland, Scotland, and from the rest of Europe decided to fund ranches, cattle, and cowboys, which led to one of the biggest economic booms in history and laid the foundation for America's dominance of the world's economy, while simultaneously funding the development of cities and infrastructure across the West. Books like The Virginian by Owen Wister began to mythologize the cowboy, and literary giants from Zane Grey to Louis L'Amour followed. Hollywood gravitated to the cowboy and to Western stories from its earliest films well into the 20th century, and they're still making them today. The greatest actors of multiple generations starred in Westerns, from Tom Mix to Roy Rogers, John Wayne to Clint Eastwood, Jimmy Stewart to Burt Lancaster. The period following World War II was dominated by Western movies, and Western movies were dominated by cowboy stories. And the influence of the cowboy wasn't felt just in literature and films, but it actually got to America's halls of power as well. Theodore Roosevelt traveled west in 1884. After the dual loss of his mother and his wife, which actually happened on the same day, and that was Valentine's Day. If you ever thought you had a bad Valentine's Day, Teddy's was worse. Well, he traveled west to start a ranch just north of Medora, North Dakota. He was indelibly shaped by the cowboy's lifestyle and the cowboys that he had befriended there. When he returned in 1900 on a campaign swing with future President William McKinley, he told locals, I'd studied a lot about men and things before I saw you fellows, but it was only when I came here that I began to know anything or to measure men rightly. In his book, Cattle Kingdom, The Hidden History of the Cowboy West, author Christopher Knowlton says that it was Roosevelt's time as a cowboy that helped to shape and refine the New York City boy into the Western man. It was deliberately defining themselves as cowboys has actually helped a couple of people who tried to become president afterwards. This is a quote from Knowlton's book. He says, the rich city boy with Ivy League credentials would become the cowboy president. And he would not be the last politician to cultivate that image of rugged independence to improve his standing with the American public. Presidents Lyndon B. Johnson, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush similarly reshaped their public image. For Lyndon Johnson, the cowboy boots, the Stetson hat, the herd of registered Herefords made a tall, lanky kid from the rural hill country of Texas look like a respectable Western cattle baron. Ronald Reagan was a former lifeguard from Illinois who'd acted in B-movie westerns until he bought a Santa Barbara ranch and styled himself a 20th century cowboy. Ivy Leaguer George W. Bush, scion of a patrician family from Greenwich, Connecticut, with deep roots on Wall Street, donned cowboy boots, a cowboy hat, and a cowboy swagger to help shed his image as a spoiled rich preppy who had attended Andover, Yale, and Harvard business schools. Not surprisingly, the public persona of the cowboy proved more politically palatable and more marketable for each of these men than the one they'd been born with. So movies, books, and presidents have all played a part in redefining the cowboy. But nothing's had more of an influence on the popular perception of the cowboy than one man, and that man is Buffalo Bill Cody. Buffalo Bill started the first outdoor Wild West show, and from its inception, as Buffalo Bill and Dr. Carver's Rocky Mountain and Prairie exhibition in 1883, all the way up until Cody's death in 1917, there was no entertainment more prevalent or successful than Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The imagery and iconography of William F. Cody are indelibly tied to the profession of cowboy, though that is one of the rare jobs that Buffalo Bill, who was a showman, scout, buffalo hunter, soldier, teamster, hotel proprietor, and sometimes town planner, never held. In his book, Buffalo Bill's America, Louis Warren explains that Cody was, quote, an absentee ranch owner who was never a cowboy. But central to Cody's vision of the Wild West was what would become the defining icon of the Western man, the cowboy. For over 20 years, the last act of Cody's Wild West show was listed in the program like this. And you can see it at the bottom there. Attack on a settler's cabin by hostile Indians, repulsed by cowboys under the leadership of Buffalo Bill. With civilization at stake and the fate of the emblematic white family on the line, the group of heroes that rode to the rescue was not comprised of professional soldiers, but always of cowboys, led by Buffalo Bill. Now, when Cody, who had been a celebrated civilian scout for the military way before he ever took to the stage, when he rode towards engagements with hostile Sioux and Cheyenne on the plains of Nebraska and the hills of the Dakota Territory, which he did, but it was never in the company of cowboys. It was always with trained soldiers. So why did Bill Cody present the cowboy as the savior of the family, of the savior of civilization itself, from the threat of savagery in his shows? To answer that, we have to look at the man Buffalo Bill called, and this is a direct quote, Buffalo Bill called him one of my dearest and most intimate friends, and that man was Texas Jack Omohundro. Texas Jack was a cowboy. In 1869, Buffalo Bill had been placed in charge of the government's livestock, at Fort McPherson in Nebraska. And just when he got put in this job, which he was very ill-suited for, the Cowboy Texas Jack rode into town at the head of 4,000 longhorn cattle from Texas. Buffalo Bill must have thought this was God sent. Here's a man who knows the job they're paying me to do. Soon they were inseparable. They hunted together, they drank together, they scouted together, they even hung wallpaper in Cody's new home together. Buffalo Bill wrote that they were pards of the plains for life. If you ever hang wallpaper with somebody, you know that's a real friend, right? If you've ever had to do that. While Cody was spending long weeks away from home scouting with the 3rd Cavalry, Texas Jack actually stayed in a spare room at the Cody home to make sure that Cody's wife Louisa and his children, his small son and 2 girls, were all safe while Cody was away. In my book, which is this one, I make the argument that a lot of our cowboys and Indians mythology can actually be traced back to a single day, a single event that had consequence that rippled out across time and across popular culture. 150 years next Tuesday, that's April 26th, 1872, Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack set out from Fort McPherson in pursuit of Minneconjou raiders. These raiders had stolen horses from nearby McPherson Station on the train line the night before, and with troops under the control of Captain Meinhold, they tracked the thieves. After a brief skirmish in which Buffalo Bill was injured and 3 warriors were killed, the Minneconjou were finally apprehended and the horses were returned. For his actions that day, Bill Cody was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was actually awarded it twice because at some point the federal government decided civilians didn't need to have been awarded the Medal of Honor, and so they rescinded the Medal of Honor from any civilian who'd been awarded it, which wasn't many. Senator Al Simpson from Wyoming decided that wasn't right and personally lobbied to have it returned. So one of these medals is with Bill Cody's family, and the other is at the Cody Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. Anyway, in a report to his superior officer about the encounter, Captain Meinhold mentions 4 men. The first of those men is Bill Cody, and he says his, quote, reputation for bravery and skill as a guide is so well established, I need not say anything else than he acted in his usual manner. The next is Sergeant Foley, who he says charged into an Indian camp without knowing how many enemies he might encounter, and First Sergeant Leroy Vokes, who bravely closed in upon an Indian while he was fired at several times and wounded him. The last man mentioned is Texas Jack Omohundro, though we can forgive Captain Meinhold for not knowing how to spell Omohundro. It's not the easiest name. But he says, Texas Jack is a very good trailer and a brave man who knows the country well, and I respectfully recommend his employment as a guide should the service of anyone in addition to Mr. Cody be needed. Cody, Foley, and Vokes, 3 of the men mentioned, were each awarded the Medal of Honor that day for gallantry in action. Perhaps because he had once served in the Confederacy, where he had been a spy and scout for General Jeb Stuart, they did not give Texas Jack a Medal of Honor. Clippings from a couple of local papers there in Nebraska help us understand better these events that happened that day. The North Platte Democrat reported that after Cody began firing at the raiders, the remainder of the command, hearing the fire, came up at full jump with Texas Jack at the head. He immediately let drive and brought his Indian down. We would mention the efforts of our heroic friend Texas Jack. Beside enjoying a reputation of a dead shot, he's well skilled in the ways of the Indians, and we're glad to know that his services have been retained by the government. Cody himself, in his biography, wrote that 2 mounted warriors closed in on me and were shooting at short range. I returned their fire and had the satisfaction of seeing one of them fall from his horse. At this moment, I felt blood trickling down my forehead, and hastily running my hand through my hair, I discovered I'd received a scalp wound. Another paper reported that to Texas Jack was Buffalo Bill indebted for his life. The thieves were pursued and overtaken by Bill and Jack. An Indian had just drawn a bead on Bill, and Jack's quick eye caught the gleam of the shining barrel, and the next instant, the noble Red was on his way to the happy hunting ground, his passage from the sublunary sphere being expedited by a bullet from Jack's rifle at a distance of 125 yards. So that's Buffalo Bill Cody. The man who, we said more than anyone else, shaped the public perception of the cowboy as the paragon of American courage and virtue, fighting Minneconjou Sioux braves alongside Texas Jack. That's the great scout, saved from death at the hands of what they called villainous Indians by a lone cowboy. Tall and lean, a natural horseman, deadly accurate with his pistol and rifle, brave and loyal to a fault, this man would be all the things that Cody urged audiences to believe about the cowboys that he led to the rescue of embattled settlers in arenas across the world, as well as their counterparts working the ranges of the American West. In the cowboy, Buffalo Bill presented a hard worker, an enduring spirit, a man of principle, an American knight. In sharing that version of the cowboy with audiences, Buffalo Bill was sharing with them his old friend, Texas Jack. Soon after that encounter with those Minneconjou Raiders up on the Loup Fork, a report from the battle, lifted straight from the pages of the North Platte Democrat, appeared again in full in the June 10th issue of Street and Smith's New York Weekly in New York City, which was a publishing house that also printed the dime novel stories of a famous novelist and frontier celebrity named Ned Buntline. Why should the novelist weary his imagination in drawing fictitious characters, it asks, when even our own land contains living heroes whose noble deeds are as marvelous as any that the mind could conceive? Ned Buntline takes his characters from life. He paints them as they are, and his admirers, aware that they're reading history, peruse his stories with an interest impossible to be aroused by mere works of fiction. So this article actually closes with a promise that says that Texas Jack, the hero of the Loop, is another story which Ned Buntline has promised to place in our hands in an early day. He's now hard at work upon it, and our readers will find that Texas Jack is a hero worthy of the esteem in which he is held by his comrade, Buffalo Bill. William F. Cody and John B. Omohundro were fighting enemy Sioux far from the fort of the Nebraska frontier in April, and appearing in stories about fighting Indians in New York papers by June. By December, they were standing on stage together, portraying Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack in a play based on the stories inspired by the reality they had lived just a few months earlier. In a very real way, before the night of December 16th, 1872, there was no Wild West. There were gamblers and lawmen, there were thieves and cowboys, there were braves and banditos roaming the plains, canyons, and mountains west of the Mississippi. But the Wild West of popular imagination, with high noon shootouts and hammer fanning heroes, was not boiled down to its essence until Ned Buntline's play, which was called The Scouts of the Prairie and Red Deviltry as It Is, premiered at Nixon's Amphitheater in Chicago. The Chicago Tribune actually issued a warning that said that the theater, which was in reality no more than a large canvas tent with wood boards for walls, would reek of the bad breath and unwashed feet of 2,000 audience members. But the warning did little to dissuade Chicago's theater-going public, as on that winter evening, Nixon's floors and balconies exceeded capacity, and eager patrons had to be turned away. The show started with an entertaining piece by a woman who was then a world-famous Italian ballerina, and she had spent the last couple of weeks delighting Chicago audiences at every major theater in the city. She did her part. The footlights finally rose. The packed house got quiet. Onto the stage walked a man, armed with a rifle, and he was greeted by the audience with thunderous applause. He warned the audience that somewhere just out there are savage warriors. And they're going to be here any minute, and I just hope my friends can get here before they do. He was talking about this, and he banged the rifle butt that he was carrying against the boards of the stage, which was a symbol to these guys who, remember, not very well-trained actors. They'd had exactly 3 rehearsals. He banged his rifle butt on the stage to tell them, it's time to come out, guys. But before they could walk out from behind the curtain and get onto the stage, suddenly a man walked from the audience, came down the middle aisle, and jumped up on the stage. He was kind of stumbling a little bit, and he held out to the speaker a bottle. It was a whiskey bottle. Maybe he meant it as an offering, a new kind of bouquet for a new kind of show. After a moment of breathless suspense, the man on the stage grabbed him by his shirt and threw him back into the audience. He smashed a couple of stage lights actually on his way, and he landed in the orchestra pit. The man said, "Let any renegade paleface dare to cross this red line, and he shall thus feel the weight of my strong arm." The audience went nuts. As the applause started to quiet, an orchestra member finally retrieved the man from inside a contrabass where he had landed and handed him to a waiting police officer. The police officer drugged the guy out, and as that was happening, the man on stage warned his audience at length about the dangers of strong drink. Finishing the impromptu temperance lecture, he again banged the butt of his rifle onto the boards of the stage, and two men finally, nervously, joined him. They stood before a painted forest backdrop, all resplendent in fringed buckskins lined with fur. The next lines belonged to the tall and handsome man standing in the middle of the group, sitting in this picture, but standing on the stage. Maybe it was because of the interruption. Maybe it was because for the first time in his 26 years, his nerves finally got the better of him. But he stood there nervously. He looked out into the anxious crowd. It got quiet. Someone in the back of the room coughed. The silent moment stretched until the older and shorter man standing to his left finally spoke. He said, "Bill, have you been out buffalo hunting again?" His voice was low and full of gravel. The tall man just turned and stared. The question was repeated. "Buffalo Bill, have you been out hunting buffalo again?" "Yeah," came the stuttering reply. "Yeah, with Milligan." Cody looked out into the sea of faces packing the theater that night, and he pointed towards a spot where Mr. Milligan and his friends were sitting in the audience. William F. Milligan. He was a wealthy paint merchant who had made a fortune selling to the town as it was rebuilding from the Great Chicago Fire that happened the preceding year. And he was well known to the Chicago crowd. And they erupted in laughter and started to cheer because Milligan had actually been buffalo hunting with Buffalo Bill earlier that summer. And he had expressed quite publicly how desperately he wanted to face a Sioux warrior in combat, right up until the moment when they spied a brave in the distance across the Nebraska prairie. "I don't believe this is one of my fighting days," he had expressed in sudden realization to the other men in the party, and then turned his horse away from the warriors. "It occurs to me that I have urgent business back in camp." Well, audience members had heard these accounts of Milligan's hunting adventure with Buffalo Bill, and their response was really all the encouragement that Buffalo Bill needed. He began to speak to the audience about the hunt, and the crowd kind of leaned forward, paying attention, hanging on his every word. Because here was the scout that they had read about in the dime novel Buffalo Bill, King of the Bordermen, written by Ned Buntline, the man who was asking the questions and standing to his left. On Bill Cody's right stood the cowboy Texas Jack. He was wearing a wide-brimmed Stetson Boss of the Plains hat, a fringed buckskin jacket, pants tucked into tall black cavalry boots. These men had ridden into hostile territory together 8 short months earlier. They'd stalked buffalo and elk together within the last couple of weeks. Now they stood in the glaring calcium lights before a standing room-only crowd. Now he had listened patiently to a couple minutes of Bill Cody's talk. And so, standing at Cody's right, he now let loose a blood-curdling war whoop, and he yelled, "Injuns!" And 10 Chicago actors, dressed as Indians, rushed onto the stage. So the 3 guys, the 3 buckskin-clad men on the stage, fired blanks from their pistols, vanquishing with haste the red threat to the thunderous applause of the audience. Nothing had gone right in the show this far. Not one line had been spoken correctly, but the audience had essentially given them 3 standing ovations. Cody's wife, Louisa Cody, later wrote in her memoir that it was at this moment that her husband, who again, he had been a Pony Express rider, He'd been a teamster, he'd been a soldier, he'd been a hunter, he'd been a scout. This was the moment, she said, he became a star. He was back at home now, with Texas Jack at his side, she wrote, pulling the triggers of his six-shooter until the stage was filled with smoke, and the hammers only clicked on exploded cartridges. They yelled, they shouted, they roared and banged away. Sounds like the formula for a good Western. That night, Texas Jack was as well known to the Chicago crowd as his partner on stage and trail, Buffalo Bill. The same readers that had voraciously torn through the pages of Buffalo Bill stories were fascinated by the man that dime novels and newspapers alike called the White King of the Pawnees, the Mustang King, the hero of the Loop Fork, and the Lasso King. Unlike the name Buffalo Bill Cody, however, the name Texas Jack Omohundro has mostly faded into the depths of history. There's no Texas Jack, Center of the West. There's never been a movie about Texas Jack. There's not an NFL team named after him. But while John B. Omohundro's name isn't always spoken of in the same hushed tones as Buffalo Bill Cody or Wild Bill Hickok, his contribution to the lasting legacy of the American West remains indelibly woven into the popular idea of the Western hero. Loyal and brave to a fault, lasso and revolver in hand, Stetson pulled low, riding west into the setting sun. Though Buffalo Bill's famous cognomen graces the professional football team from Buffalo, New York, you knew they were named after him, right? In a very real way, without Texas Jack, there might not be a Dallas Cowboys. I mean, look, who copied who, really? While his friends, Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill, and this is him with them, there's Texas Jack, Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, while they were rendered iconic as the preeminent scout and lawman of the American West, Omohundro's legacy as the first cowboy on the American stage remains fundamental to the mythologized Western hero introduced to the world by Buffalo Bill and personified in stories of dime novelists Ned Buntline and Prentice Ingram, the books of guys like Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour, and the movies of guys like John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. If the idealized American man is the frontier cowboy, then the genesis of the American cowboy in popular culture is Texas Jack Omohundro. When he stood on stage with those men, thank you, Jack. When he stood on stage with those men, Texas Jack was the picture of the cowboy. His costume always included that ever-present Stetson boss of the plains, which would soon be universally referred to as the cowboy hat. Remember, Buffalo Bill was a scout. Have you ever heard a Stetson called a scout hat? No. Wild Bill was a lawman and a gambler. He was a great pistol shot. Have you ever heard the Stetson referred to as the marshal's hat or the lawman's hat? No, it's the cowboy hat. He always wore his tall black cavalry boots. The fringed buckskin jacket always opened to reveal the Lone Star of Texas emblazoned on his shirt. He carried his lasso, his rifle, his revolver, and always his Bowie knife, prepared for any danger that might come his way. And more often than not, that danger took the form of hostile Indian warriors. These kind of stage encounters, Texas Jack locked into deadly combat against a tomahawk-wielding brave, struggling to save the life of his best friend Buffalo Bill, proved so captivating that they spawned the Cowboys and Indians backyard games of generations. Because the idea of cowboys fighting Indians on the outskirts of civilization is so firmly ingrained into the collective conscience that it seems cliched. But the reality of the cowboy stands in stark contrast with romantic depictions in stories and movies, which you know if you've ever done any cowboy work. By the time of the big Texas cattle drives of the late 1860s, herders meticulously avoided conflict with native tribes. And this was despite the fact that there had already been a decimation of native populations between the cattle ranches of Texas and the rail towns of Kansas by disease and the relegation of Native Americans to reservations. Ranch owners entrusted their cowboys with the care of their valuable stock. Ensuring the value of these charges during transportations really made cowboys more akin to modern truck drivers than leather-clad knights. Cattle drives along the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, and all the others lasted only from the end of the Civil War in 1866 until around the mid-1890s, when a combination of rail lines and hundreds of miles of barbed wire fence rendered the job of trail-driving cowboy obsolete. During the scant 30 years of cowboy primacy, it was swift streams swollen by rain, lightning, and falls from horseback and disease that accounted for the majority of cowboy deaths. A cowboy was more likely to draw his gun on a farmer than on a card cheat across the town square at high noon. He was more likely to fire his rifle at a coyote than a Comanche brave. Dust and tedium were the rule of a cowboy's work, as was enduring the worst of conditions to ensure top dollar for beef. Unlike the fiction, the real cowboy's life was far from romantic. Lon Taylor, in his book, wrote that by all rights he should have joined the hunters of Kentucky, the whalers, the flatboatmen, the plainsmen, and all the other American types who briefly caught the popular imagination, were popularized on the stage and in song, and were then forgotten. But the open-range cowboy was never forgotten. Well, the reason that the cowboy endured while all those other professions were forgotten is that after the untimely death at the age of 33 of his cowboy friend Texas Jack in 1880, Buffalo Bill Cody refused to let the public forget. Where once a lone cowboy rode with Buffalo Bill across the prairies of Nebraska, now hundreds of cowboys followed his charge in the spectacle of the Wild West. Where once there had been a single cowboy standing on stage twirling his lasso, now a legion of men demonstrated cowboy skills for audiences worldwide. Not content to show them the embodiment of his cowboy friend, Buffalo Bill ensured that Texas Jack's experience as a cowboy was also enshrined in show programs that he handed out to millions of men, women, and children when they visited the Wild West show in stops in cities across America and throughout Europe. From its inaugural show in 1883, and in long stands at New York's Madison Square Garden in 1886, at Queen Victoria's 1887 Diamond Jubilee in London, and at Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893, where it is very likely that Will Rogers got one of these programs as they were handing them out to everyone that came in, the Wild West Show's programs contained a section simply titled The Cowboy, written by Texas Jack in the summer of 1877. The Cowboy began the piece that introduced the profession to all of these eager spectators. How often spoken of, how falsely imagined, how greatly despised were not known, and how little understood. I've been there considerable. With depictions of stampedes and storms, cowboys singing to restless steers at night, and cow scents, Omohundro describes a profession requiring the patience of Job, but peopled by ambitious, adventurous, and rebellious young men who he says are, quote, taught at school to admire the deceased little Georgie Washington in exploring adventures, though maybe not equaling him in cherry tree goodness. How many of these brave cowboys never finish, he wonders in conclusion, but mark the trail with their silent graves? No one can tell. But when Gabriel toots his horn, the Chisholm Trail will swarm with cowboys. Howsomever, we'll all be there, let's hope, for a happy trip when we say to this planet, adios. Sounds like something a cowboy would say, because it was. And searching for a significant example of the kind of man that Buffalo Bill, again, a jayhawker, a soldier, a hunter, a scout, but not a cowboy, would elevate above all other professions in his simulacrum of the real West, presented always as absolute truth to the huge audiences watching it across the world, one need look no further than John B. Texas Jack Omohundro, Cowboy. Perhaps the breadth of cowboy adventures in literature and film can also be attributed to the well-publicized exploits of Texas Jack. Years before Sitting Bull and his Lakota warriors could travel with the Wild West show, Texas Jack led the Pawnee on their annual summer buffalo hunt, and later invited to his touring company a man named Donald McKay, who was a Cayuse native who'd served as a scout during the Modoc War of 1873. He also invited along Donald's daughter, Minnie. They both toured with Texas Jack years before Buffalo Bill included actual natives in his show. Before Cody's show sat at the entrance to the 93 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Texas Jack set up a Western-themed hotel, saloon, and Shooting Gallery at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial. Before Bill Cody and Dr. Carver launched the Wild West Show in 1883, Texas Jack and Dr. Carver displayed their skills with rifle, pistol, and bow and arrow at a series of exhibitions in 1878. This was actually Dr. Carver's tour, and he got very mad at newspapers because they always printed Texas Jack's name bigger. And he said, "These are my shows, and my name should be big." And they said, "Yeah, but he's Texas Jack." Nearly a quarter of a century before Bill Cody established the town that bears his name east of the Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, Texas Jack explored the Yellowstone Park in 1874, 2 years after it was opened, with the Earl of Dunraven. He blazed a new trail into the park from the southeast in 1877, and he rescued some tourists from attack by Nez Perce fleeing the army troops through the park in 1878. It's not a great picture, but it was taken in 1878. That is Texas Jack, second from the left, standing. The three people there were actually rescued by he and his party after, that's a woman, her brother, and her younger sister. The woman's husband was shot and left for dead. At this time, when they took this picture, they actually believe he had been killed. He crawled his way to safety over the course of 14 days after being shot once in the leg and once in the head. Crawled into camp 2 weeks later, and everyone was surprised he was alive when he crawled into camp and said, "Does anybody have any coffee?" Better than I would be after all that time. In 1873, Texas Jack had married his beautiful co-star, the peerless Giuseppina Morlacci, the Italian prima ballerina who was then the most famous dancer in the world, as she introduced the can-can to America in 1868. Texas Jack led Western hunts for aristocrats like the Irish Earl of Dunraven, Sir John Ray Reed of England, and Count Otto Frank von Liechtenstein of Germany, all significant figures in the coming boom of the American cattle industry. He scouted for General Terry in pursuit of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull in the aftermath of Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn or Greasy Grass. He surprised Thomas Edison one night in a Wyoming hotel when he shot a weather vane on a train station from Edison's hotel window to prove he was, quote, "the boss pistol shot of the West." If the life of the average cowboy was trail dust and tedium, Texas Jack's was never short on excitement and adventure. It's little wonder it took scores of cowboys to replace this one man in Buffalo Bill's show. In his book, Louis Warren writes that William Cody seldom spoke of death or of people who had died. In all his correspondence, there's barely a mention of any deceased friends or acquaintances. He wrote no poignant words about Wild Bill Hickok, Sitting Bull, or Nate Salisbury. No matter how tragic their deaths, he seldom spoke of the loss. But Buffalo Bill did write multiple dime novels about his cowboy friend Texas Jack. And in 1908, which was 28 years after Omohundro's death, Cody assembled the entire cast and crew of the Wild West at Leadville, Colorado's Evergreen Cemetery, where Jack was buried. There he delivered an impassioned eulogy for a man he called one of my dearest and most intimate friends, one of the original Texas cowboys back when life on the plains was a hardship and a trying duty. Cody then purchased the permanent gravestone that today marks the final resting place of Texas Jack. And nearly a decade later, on January 6th, 1917, Buffalo Bill rode through Leadville for the final time on a return visit from Glenwood Springs to Denver. He was too weak to leave his train car, but he sat up in bed when they told him he was in Leadville and told his daughter about the grave of Texas Jack, his old friend and partner. 4 days later, Buffalo Bill was dead. There are very few men who are remembered in the way that America and the world remember Buffalo Bill. Though America largely forgot about Texas Jack Omohundro, the cowboy who first popularized the profession, the cowboy whose descriptions on his life and the open range spoke from those programs handed out at each stop of Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the cowboy who saved Buffalo Bill's life. America remembered the names of the legendary lawmen and the outlaws, of the braves and the bandits and the soldiers and the scouts, but it forgot the name of its most important open-range cowboy. America forgot, but Buffalo Bill remembered. And because Buffalo Bill remembered Texas Jack, the world still remembers the cowboy. But Texas Jack's impact on the popular culture version of the cowboy isn't just limited to his relationship with Buffalo Bill. In that eulogy that Cody gave at the grave of Texas Jack, he says that, quote, after the war, this is the Civil War, Texas Jack drifted westward and located in Texas, where he took up the hazardous work of the cowboy. He was one of the original Texas cowboys when life on the plains was a hardship and a trying duty. When they began to drive the cattle to the northern country, he engaged in that occupation. He followed the herds northward and returned after each trip for another herd. Finally, he located at North Platte, Nebraska, and it was there that I first met him. He was an expert trailer and a scout. I soon recognized this, and I tried to secure his appointment in the United States service, but the authorities were unwilling to hire discharged Confederate scouts, so I had to take the matter to the Secretary of War. After much persuasion, I was given permission to hire him. In this capacity, I learned to know him and to respect his bravery and ability. He was a whole-souled, brave, generous, and good-hearted man. Later, he and I went east to go into the show business. He was the first to do a lasso act upon the stage. So Texas Jack, in popularizing his profession and in becoming America's first cowboy star, introduced the very tool that Will Rogers would utilize to make his entrance into show business 30 years later. Those 30 years between that fateful night that Texas Jack stood on that Chicago stage and the day that Will Rogers wandered into the grounds of a Wild West show in Ladysmith, South Africa, turned one man's show of skill into a viable form of entertainment, stretching from the theaters of America to the showgrounds of South Africa, to Australia, to Europe, and across the globe. The entertainment that began with Texas Jack Omohundro and was embodied in Will Rogers would of course continue to grow, encompassing actors from William S. Hart and Tom Mix in the early days to John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, from Kirk Douglas and Gary Cooper to Emilio Estevez and Val Kilmer, from Jimmy Stewart and Burt Lancaster today to Idris Elba or Benedict Cumberbatch. Cowboys and Westerns became not just an institution, but America's self-held mythology, our very picture of who we are and what we want to be as a country. So I can safely say that without Texas Jack Omohundro, there wouldn't be a museum here in Claremore dedicated to the life of Will Rogers, American entertainment legend. But I don't just mean that without Texas Jack introducing and popularizing the cowboy, that there would be no place for Will Rogers to leave the hard work of cattle herding and become a star. Because there's another, a more personal connection between Texas Jack, America's first cowboy star, and Will Rogers, Oklahoma's favorite son. Before he was a stage star, back when Texas Jack, back when Texas Jack was actually a working cowboy, he chanced upon a ransacked wagon train. And it had an escort of dead soldiers scalped nearby. As they inspected the wagons, he noticed that there were a number of dead settlers, and they'd come west with this military escort bound probably for Oregon, maybe for California, but they'd come across the plains. Texas Jack followed the trail for a while to see where it went, and then he rode back to the nearest fort and got some of the soldiers there to come with him. They followed the trail again and came upon a group of Comanche. They got the drop on the Comanche, and Texas Jack and the soldiers were able to rescue a boy and two small girls that had been taken as captive by the warriors. As they escorted the children back to safety on the backs of some Comanche ponies they decided to take with them, Jack pondered what to do with these children. He asked the boy, "What's your name, son?" The boy thought about it for a minute and then asked, "Well, what's yours?" "Jack." The boy thought about it for another minute and nodded, and he said, "Me too." Texas Jack took those children to a Fort Worth orphanage, and he sold the ponies, and he offered to fund their education. There's no historical record about what happened to those young girls, but we actually know a little bit about what happened to that young boy. He was so young that he actually couldn't remember his name or the names of his parents. So for the rest of his life, he called himself Texas Jack Jr. Later in his life, Texas Jack Jr. wrote a little poem about his childhood, and it included a verse about his capture by the Indians and his rescue by Omohundro. You didn't think you were coming to a poetry reading. Come give me your attention and see the right and wrong. It's a simple story and it won't detain you long. I'll try to tell the reason why we are bound to roam and why we are so friendless and we never have a home. My home is in the saddle upon a pony's back. I am a roving cowboy and find the hostile track. They say I am a sure shot and danger I never knew, but I've often heard this story and now I'll tell it to you. In 1868, a little immigrant band was massacred by Indians bound west by overland. They scalped our noble soldiers, the immigrants had to die, and the only living captives were 2 small girls and I. I was rescued from the Indians by a brave and noble man who trailed the thieving Indians and fought them hand to hand. He was noted for his bravery while on the enemy's track. He has a noble history, and his name is Texas Jack. Old Jack could tell a story, if he were only here, of the trouble and the hardships of the Western pioneer. He could tell you how the mothers and the comrades lost their lives, and how the noble fathers were scalped before our eyes. I was raised among the cowboys. My saddle is my home, and I'll always be a cowboy, no difference where I roam. And like that noble hero, my help I'll volunteer, and I'll try to be of service to the Western pioneer. I am a roving cowboy, I've worked upon the trail. I shot the shaggy buffalo and heard the coyotes wail. I've slept upon my saddle and covered by the moon. I expect to keep it up, dear friends, until I meet my doom. Texas Jack Jr. visited the Omohundro family home in Virginia, and he told them about how their brother, their son, had rescued him. And he asked their permission to use the name as he set up to take up his benefactor's mantle as an actor and a showman, joining Wild West shows in America before traveling to England with Mexico Joe's Wild West show. Texas Jack Jr. starred as Frederick Russell Burnham, American Chief of Scouts, in an early British film called Major Wilson's Last Stand, which depicted battles between the British South Africa Company and native Ndebele warriors in present-day Zimbabwe. He decided he'd made his mark on cinema, so he came back to America, where he started the Texas Jack's Wild West Show and Circus, which he toured around the world. Texas Jack Jr. dropped the junior when he started to perform outside the United States again, and he married a fellow performer named Lily Dunbar on March 25, 1891, in Bundaberg, Queensland, Australia. Lily took the surname Jack as a married woman, and they had one child who they named Hazel Jack. By 1897, the couple was living in London, England, and Jack was occasionally racing his horse against bicycle riders, enlisted as a professional horse trainer. In November of that year, Texas Jack Jr. filed for divorce from Lily, stating that, quote, on the 13th day of October, 1897, my said wife, the said Lily Jack, committed adultery with F.E. Manel at number 25 Whitcomb Street, Coventry Street, in the county of London. I only bring it up because included in the divorce petition is a brief description of Jack's childhood. You can see here he says, my parents are unknown, and ever since my birth I've been known and called by the name of Texas Jack. I have no other Christian or surname whatever. As when a child, my parents were killed by the American Indians in Texas, who carried me off to their camp, where I lived until I was recovered from them by the United States of America's troops about 1868. We don't know whether the divorce was granted, but Lily Dunbar Jack died shortly afterwards, passing away in London at the age of 31 in April of 1902. Sadly, Texas Jack Jr. actually died just over 5 years later, October 25th, 1905. His death notice lists him as a widower and notes that he left the entirety of his estate to a 14-year-old daughter, Hazel Jack, listed as living in Prahran, Melbourne, Australia. It was this man, Texas Jack Jr., who just 3 years before his untimely death hired Will Rogers on the spot when he demonstrated the crinoline, determined to keep the young man from earning that 50-pound reward. It was Texas Jack Jr. who taught Will Rogers to always leave the crowd wanting more, and who helped him turn his skill with a lasso into a stage act that would become renowned around the world. It was this Texas Jack who wrote the letter of introduction that Will Rogers carried with him when he left South Africa, headed for Australia, to work with another Wild West show, and headed for a future enshrined as one of the greatest entertainers in American history. That letter, which Will Rogers actually kept for the rest of his life, reads as follows. I have the very great pleasure in recommending Mr. W.P. Rogers, the Cherokee Kid, to circus proprietors. He's performed with me during my present South African trip, and I consider him to be the champion trick rough rider and lasso thrower of the world. He is sober, industrious, hard-working at all times, and is always to be relied on. I shall be very pleased to give him an engagement at any time, should he wish to return. Signed, Texas Jack. When Will Rogers left home, he didn't set out to become a showman. He set out to be a cowboy. He became a showman when he demonstrated his skill with a lasso, demonstrated to a man who had been rescued by and now used the name of Texas Jack, the first cowboy who didn't set out to become a showman, but became one anyway. The line of cowboy performers extends in a direct line from Texas Jack Omohundro, the first famous cowboy and America's first cowboy star, to Texas Jack Jr., rescued on the plains as a young child and eager to take up his namesake's mantle as a showman and a cowboy performer, and then to Will Rogers, who took up the lasso and made it his own, endearing himself and the profession to a new generation of Americans. 3 men who never set out to become stars, 3 men who set out to become cowboys, and 3 men who ended up as legends. Thank you very much. Did anybody have any questions? Oh, I guess let's, there's a microphone, because I think there's people that may be watching on the internet, and they want to hear the question. Say it to the microphone so that the people at home can...
Okay. Well, why were you interested in Texas Jack to begin with? Because we think of him sort of as an obscure person now. Right.
Why interested in Texas Jack in the first place? The real reason is because, so there's a couple reasons. The first one was, at some point, my family traveled out west a lot when I was younger, and we'd stop at big museums like this one or the Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming, but also at some small ones. And a lot of regional history museums are mostly just collections of like old farm tools that somebody left to the museum and now no one knows where to put. But as we went through those, you start to see these names of people repeated. I think that everybody that has any knowledge of the American West knows who Buffalo Bill Cody is and knows who Wild Bill Hickok is. Well, at some point, I was talking with my dad about the fact that if you'd lived in the East Coast or in any real major city in America in the 1870s, you could have gone, in fact, if you lived in New York City, you could have gone down to Broadway, paid your quarter, and gone to see a show with Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, and Texas Jack Omohundro as its stars. And so I thought, well, that's weird. I know those 2 guys, and I have no idea about that third guy. But if his name was up on the marquee with theirs, if it was listed in the same newspaper reports, and if he was talked about in the same way by people at the time, why don't I know him? And so then I thought, well, I need to answer that question for myself. So I started researching it, and by the time I came up with an answer, I realized, well, everybody else ought to know this too. Somebody ought to write a book. But since no one was, I did. And here we are. Anybody else?
So, first of all, wasn't Texas Jack mentioned in the movie Tombstone?
So, yeah, here's what you end up with. The first Texas Jack is Texas Jack Omohundro. When Texas Jack died, the name Texas Jack kind of became a stand-in for Wild West type. At the time, there are advertisements for Smith & Wesson and Colt revolvers that say, come get your Texas Jack gun. or advertisements for Stetson-style hats that say, "Come get your Texas Jack hat." When a guy named John Vermillion came out west and ended up kind of caught up in the stuff that was going on in Cochise County, Arizona, he didn't have a nickname, and so they just kind of referred to him as Texas Jack because it was just a good name for a Western guy. When they asked him, "Why do they call you Texas Jack?" he said, "Well, because I'm from Virginia," because that's where Texas Jack Omohundro had been from. Since then, people forgot that, and they just assume there's a Texas Jack. There's actually 4 or 5 different guys with increasing or decreasing levels of fame that kind of use the name, but he was the first.
And where did you find most of your information on Texas Jack?
Sadly, Texas Jack died in Leadville, Colorado, and he was very far away from his home. He was living at the time in Massachusetts with his wife. So if there were any documents, anything he had on him, they didn't survive. He and his wife never had children, so they had no one to pass on anything to. So there's no diaries, letters, collections of stuff. So most of my information is researching what had already been written, and then trying to prove or debunk that against newspaper articles and contemporary accounts at the time. Thankfully, it is now very easy to get old newspaper material archived on the internet. I can only imagine, there was actually a book about Texas Jack in the 50s called Buckskin and Satin. And sometimes I think it doesn't have as much information as I do, but anything he wanted to find out, Herschel Logan was the author. Anything he wanted to find out, he had to, get in his car and drive to, Nebraska to hope that the little library there had kept a newspaper, and maybe they did and maybe they didn't, and maybe they kept one and the next 7 are gone, whereas I can just type it into a search, and if it isn't there, I move on with my life. His commitment was a lot more than mine. But most of it is newspapers and articles from the time. Although I will say some of those newspapers just accepted anything as truth. There's a whole chapter in my book where I talk about it. Remember, I told you that he rescued some tourists in the Yellowstone Park from Nez Perce Indians. Well, when that happened, one of the guys that was around immediately left and went to Sioux City and told a newspaper there that Texas Jack was a coward, and when the fight started, Texas Jack had run, and he told all this stuff. And the only reason I know that that's not true is because there was a diary written by one of the people that Texas Jack rescued that said, "Texas Jack rescued us." But also because Texas Jack apparently read that article in the Sioux City newspaper and walked into the office of the New York Sun, slammed it down and said, "Let me tell you what really happened, write this down word for word," and they did by saying, "He's slamming his fist on the desk and we're going to do what he says." So he got to say his piece too. But it's just because there's access to all that now, thankfully. Anything else? Any other?
After I discovered you online and read I just poured through your Facebook page.
Oh, good.
Read everything I could read. I found somewhere, and I don't know where, I followed lots of bunny trails, something about that your Texas Jack actually invented or whatever, the crinoline. Is that true?
I have seen that printed. I'd like it to be true, but I kind of feel like I have no way to. If I can't say that I know it's true, I would rather just not mention it than to say, "Hey, this might be true." I feel like it was my job to, as objectively as I could, find the truth. And it's really hard because Texas Jack wasn't just a star like a movie star. He was also a folk hero. So people were telling stories about Texas Jack even while he was alive that were like Paul Bunyan stories. In fact, on Easter, I posted a thing that the New York Weekly reported that they had gone down to this was on Easter 1873. They had gone down to a church, and the woman who was in charge of teaching the youth class was talking about the Easter message. And when she got to the part about crucifixion, one of the boys raised his hand and said, "I bet you they wouldn't have done it if Texas Jack had been there." So it's really hard to separate fact and fiction. I think I've done a good job of it, but I've heard that he invented the crinoline. It would have really tied this whole thing together if I could say for sure he did. I just don't know. Any other questions? Texas Jack, Wild West, general topics?
You said Texas Jack died at an early age. What did he die from? Was it natural causes?
It
or-
was. He did not die with his boots on, as you say. The likelihood is that Texas Jack had been dealing with tuberculosis for a little while. His mom had died of tuberculosis at a relatively young age. She actually died while he was away fighting in the Civil War. And it had been an ongoing problem within the family. And there's newspaper reports that say within the year or two before he died, every once in a while you'll see one that says, he's lost the raven luster of his hair, or Texas Jack fell ill after this show or whatever. And tying together that kind of preponderance of evidence, what I think happened is he had tuberculosis. He was already a pretty heavy drinker, as a lot of the kind of authentic plainsmen of the time were. He was a heavy smoker. He'd come from a plantation in Virginia. He'd been smoking his whole life. Reports from Buffalo Bill and others talk about how Texas Jack is never seen without a cigar or his pipe in his hand. So he was smoking a lot. He probably had tuberculosis, and smoking can soothe tuberculosis, so a lot of them did. When he got to Leadville, on top of that, he was drinking a lot and caught pneumonia. And the pneumonia on top of the tuberculosis, while probably drinking enough to not realize or feel how cold it was at what was then and remains the highest constantly populated city in the United States. It just was too much for him. He was almost 34. He was about a month away from his 34th birthday when he died. Which is one of the main reasons that people just don't remember him. He was so young, and he didn't die like Wild Bill, who they had been friends since their days in Kansas together, who, of course, was famously assassinated in 1876 in Deadwood, which made newspaper reports all over. Texas Jack's death was reported, but because there was no spectacle to it, it didn't kind of live on in the collective memory the way that a Buffalo Bill, who, was the most famous guy in the world when he died, or Wild Bill, who was notable in his death. So sadly was not as remembered. But I guess that's good, because no one else wrote a book about him, and they waited for me. Anything else? Anybody else?
Thank you, ma'am. What cemetery in Leadville is Texas Jack buried?
He is in the Evergreen Cemetery. And in fact, the last time I went up to Leadville, his funeral was held at the Tabor Opera House, which when it was built was the biggest building in the state of Colorado. Horace Tabor, who built it, was a silver magnate, and he was one of the richest men in the country, built this extravagant opera house that Texas Jack's wife actually was playing at the time. Well, they had his funeral there, so when I was up there, I thought, well, let's walk from where they had the funeral up the street, turn left, and go down to the Evergreen Cemetery. And I told my wife and my daughter, I said, yeah, this will be a great little walk. We'll see. We'll walk the route of his funeral procession. And I forgot that at 10,000 feet, and me coming from about 600 feet, that was. So by the time I got back, I was, hands on knees and all that. But it's just a short little jaunt from the main part of Leadville to the cemetery. And there's actually a lot of famous people there. Charlie Vivian, who was the founder of the Elks, the Fraternal Order of the Elks, is buried up there. A couple other famous people. Doc Holliday spent some time there. It's a great western town if you ever get a chance to go see it. Anybody else?
What became of Texas Jack's wife?
Oh, yeah. So Texas Jack's wife was Giuseppina Morlacci. Like I said, she had introduced the can-can dance to the United States. She was from Italy. She trained at the La Scala School, which was the most prestigious ballet academy in the whole world. She trained under a guy named Carlo Blasi, who was supposed to be the greatest ballet teacher who ever lived. She was kind of a child prodigy. By the time she was a teenager, she was appearing all throughout Europe. She had gone to Paris, where she picked up this nickname, the Peerless, which is how newspapers are. Newspapers always called her the Peerless Morlacci. She was one of the few, one of the earliest celebrities that had the one name recognition. She had it before anybody else. And when she came to the United States, she was already so famous as a dancer that the guy that brought her had this idea that he would insure her legs for $100,000. This is 1868 money. He insured her legs for $100,000, and newspapers said her legs were now worth more than Kentucky. Well, she lived only a few years after Texas Jack died. She, by all accounts, was just heartbroken. Some of the reports say that she retired from the stage immediately. She actually played a few shows on the way back home. But once she got back she was living in Billerica and Lowell, Massachusetts. She basically just retired from public life. She had the money. She didn't have to do anything anymore. She did spend time. She would offer her skill. She would train. Lowell, Massachusetts was a mill town. Most of the textiles from the Northeast came from Lowell, and the girls that worked in these mills were being paid nothing. Well, she offered free ballet lessons to these women and their daughters if they wanted them. So she spent about 6 years after Texas Jack died just doing that. She occasionally got offered exorbitant amounts of money to come back to the New York stage and perform again, but she always turned it down. Her sister died her sister was the only other relative she had nearby, died in 1885, and she died the next year of stomach cancer. She's buried at St. Patrick's Cemetery in Lowell, and I always think it's sad that she's buried in Massachusetts and Texas Jack is in Leadville. I don't know which should be at the other place, but it feels sad they're not together somehow. Anything else? I could keep doing this. Well, I appreciate it, and again, I would really like to thank the museum for the opportunity to come do this. Most of the time, it's just me telling this to my wife, and she's like, "I've heard it before." My family has been amazingly tolerant of Texas Jack anecdotes. I know you're thinking, "Oh God, I could listen to that guy for 2 or 3 more hours." Well, they've been with me for all these years, so. But I appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your support. Oh, and I guess if anybody feels like buying a book, or I've got the Wild West magazine. This is a cover story I did for them on Texas Jack. I'll be out there with some books and stuff if you want one. Thank you.